my God, there's voter fraud everywhere. Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to Mongrel Politics. Today we're going to have a little chat about, as I said, voter fraud. And, you know, as I said in the last video that we had, and I personally had made it a point to steer clear of subjects that would upset, or if we want to use the modern parlance, trigger people. We have been very much trained to experience immediate feelings and become very upset about certain subjects in our civic dialogue. And amongst those is the topic of voter fraud. And so I'm going to ask you guys to tamp down your feelings and hear what I have to say. And again, this channel, we're not going to indulge in conspiracy theory. We're not going to indulge in things that are not provable, that are not verifiable. And when we say provable and verifiable, it has to be from, and we can have a conversation at another point about what is and is not legitimate sources of information. But in this particular case, I'm going to cite at least one example from something somebody could ostensibly consider to be a left source. And we're also going to cite information from what one could consider a right source, as in right wing of the political spectrum. So please just put your feelings aside and your preconceived notions, because at the end of the day, we, the American people, have been deeply and profoundly manipulated. And it is an ongoing problem. And the only solution to it is that we ourselves refuse to continue to participate in the programming and the brainwashing and the attempt to capture our imaginations and our emotions so that we can then be manipulated to create a world that is not beneficial to those of us who work for a living, but beneficial to those who already have way too much influence, power, and control over our economics, over the ideas that are out in the world, over what we consider to be possible and what we consider to be impossible. So, you know, the first thing that I want to talk about, and as somebody who has, I've lived in northern and rural Idaho. I've lived in eastern and rural Oregon and Washington. I am originally from the Rust Belt Midwest, and then over 20 years of driving a semi-truck all over this country. So there really is no region of this country that I have not touched, where I have not established friendships, where I have not had thoughtful and meaningful conversations with folks. And something that I have seen over and over again, it's something that pops up, and as a matter of fact, something that just happened here recently. You know, going back to the 2020 elections when Joe Biden was elected, I distinctly remember a number of my conservative friends saying things like, there's no way that man could have been elected. I don't know anybody who would support him. And on the other side of that, when I was living in the Pacific Northwest, in Portland specifically, twice I saw people say, there's no way anybody's going to vote for George W. Bush a second time. It's just not going to happen. And I also remember people being very comfortable saying, there's no way anybody would vote for Donald Trump. And the reason for this is not that y'all are dumb. That's not that you ain't paying attention. It is the fact that increasingly over the last several decades in this country, we have all siloed ourselves into communities. And so if you live in a rural community that is pretty reliably conservative, you can be forgiven for not knowing a single person who would vote for or align with or, you know, support the Democratic Party. But that doesn't mean that there aren't also a lot of people out there that you've never met who do. And in that same respect, if you live in a place like a Portland or a San Francisco or a Seattle or a New York, you can be forgiven for not knowing anybody who would support a Donald Trump or a George W. Bush or espouse conservative views. If you do find yourself in either of those areas, I've known people in conservative areas who actually had some liberal views, but they kept their mouth shut because they didn't want to be ridiculed or derided or deal with the BS that comes with that. In that same respect, I knew folks when I was living in Portland who had some conservative sort of traditional values that they just kept to themselves because they didn't want to deal with constantly having to argue with people or defend their positions when they were the only person in the room who was going to defend those positions. But the whole "I don't know anybody who would have" argument is pretty easy to blow out of the water. So I'm going to put up on the screen now a map that we are all very familiar with. We have all seen this map. We've seen this, and that contributes to this idea that there's no way anybody would have voted for a Democrat. Just look at that map. Look at all of that red and those tiny little pockets of blue here and there. But what that map is not showing you is the number of votes cast. There's a saying going around right now, which is land does not vote, people do. And so if you look at that map, you could be forgiven for thinking that America is overwhelmingly conservative or supports Republican candidates. And that map is from the 2020 election. But let's keep that map, but adjust it for population. So here comes the hard data. And what you will notice is that empty land, where there aren't any people to vote, is now color-coded white. And when you start to look at this map, the way our country is pretty close to 50-50 split starts to make a lot more sense. And how a given election could go one way or the other starts to make a bit more sense. And what you're looking at here is the larger circles indicate higher populations, whereas the smaller dots indicate smaller populations. And I wasn't able to find the graph that charts it out, but if you look at this image, you can start to see probably pretty clearly how areas with lower population density tend to vote more consistently conservative. And areas with higher population density, in other words, cities, tend to vote more consistently Democratic. And so the notion that there's no way anybody could, or these numbers don't make sense, et cetera, sort of falls apart once you start getting into the data and looking at the population spreads and how that breaks down. So that is, in essence, point number one that I wanted to address with regards to voter and election fraud and numbers not being accurate. The next one is, and this is where people are probably going to have some feels, but here's the one thing that we want to throw up is that this one here, in 2012, Arizona State University conducted a project where they published a database of over 2,000 alleged cases of voter fraud. And keep in mind, at that time in 2012, the population of Arizona was a little bit over 6.5 million. And so the 2,000 cases of alleged voter fraud that they found, that amounts to 0.000003 cases for every vote cast. And out of those roughly 2,000 cases of voter fraud that they found, nearly half of those cases were dropped, as it was determined that it was either clerical errors or honest mistakes made by individuals, and so there was no reason to prosecute. So you're looking at a population of 6.5 million people, and out of that, they found roughly 1,000 cases of legitimate voter fraud. By any measure, not enough to significantly change an election. Now, I understand that some of you might say, "Oh, that came from the University of Arizona. It's a liberal, or it's a bastion of liberal indoctrination, and therefore it can't be trusted." So here we're going to cite you yet another source, and this is the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. It's largely responsible for the policies of not only Ronald Reagan, but largely responsible for a lot of the policies that the current Trump administration has enacted. And they did a research study going all the way back to 1979, looking at national occurrences of voter fraud. And they found 1,465 proven cases of voter fraud in 44 years. Texas is just as one sample from that study that they did. Texas, as an example, from 2005 to 2022, out of 107 million votes, they found 103 cases of proven voter fraud, which amounts to 0.000096% of proven cases of voter fraud. Again, in that example, not statistically significant and very unlikely, next to not possible, to significantly impact the results of a national election. Now, this doesn't mean that voter fraud isn't an issue that should be taken seriously. But as with so many of the other things that we talk about in our public policy, in our public life, and our civil discourse in this country, the volume on it has been turned up to such a degree that it is completely disproportionate to the actual impact on our lives, or in this case, on our actual elections. I mean, if you turn on Fox News or OAN or anything else, they will talk about it as if it is an existential crisis threatening the foundation of our democracy, that there are millions of illegal immigrants or dead people casting ballots to sway elections. And I just want to point out, again, I don't want to pick on anybody, but it was very interesting to me that, in 2020, when Trump was in the White House and Joe Biden got elected, there were screams of voter fraud, even though Trump and the Republicans basically had control of the government. And then you flip it around, and then when Joe Biden was in control of the government and the Democrats were in control, in charge of things, Trump won. So either there is widespread voter fraud, or it is not the issue that they portray it to be. Now, as I said, we found that with just those cases there, they found prosecutable a little over 1,000 cases in that Arizona study, and a little over 1,400 cases going back to 1979, and then 103 cases in Texas between 2005 and 22. And the reason those numbers are even known is because those individuals were prosecuted for committing voter fraud. So it is a problem, but our judicial system is on it. There are checks and balances and measures in place to discourage it already and to prosecute it when it is discovered. And the important takeaway is that the numbers, whether you're looking at a university study or whether you're looking at a conservative think tank's research on the case, the numbers are not significant enough for us to be talking about it as if it is the problem that it is. But I do believe that we do have what one could consider to be a form of fraud with regards to our elections in this country. And as long as we're talking about this kind of stuff, we never have the space or the mental bandwidth to talk about the actual fraud that actually impacts our elections, the legislation that has a very real and tangible impact on our lives as Americans. And this is where I want to, as usual, direct your eyes away from the poor, the powerless, the working class, and cast your eyes upwards to the ones that actually control the systems. And there's this quote from back in the day, and I forget the guy's name, but I'm going to put him up right now. That says, he said, "I don't care." And this guy was found, basically his career ended in disgrace. He was found to be extraordinarily corrupt. But he says, "I don't care who does the voting as long as I get to do the nominating." And that is a problem that is still with us today. We can go and look at the 2020 Democratic primaries, and the way, regardless of how you feel about him, there were a couple of candidates that were getting a lot of grassroots support, and the DNC put their fingers on the scales and altered the way, the criteria for making it to the next debates multiple times to try and get the outcome that they wanted, as opposed to just standing back and making clear and established rules from the outset and not changing them at any point, so that the actual support of the citizens of this country led to the best possible candidate. And depending upon who you talk to, depending upon who people supported, people are still to this day fairly aggrieved about the way Bernie Sanders was treated by the DNC, the way Andrew Yang was treated by the DNC, and the way, what was her name, Marianne Williamson, were treated by the DNC. And regardless of about how you feel about any of these people or their policies, that's not the point. The point is that the power brokers behind closed doors within the DNC thought they knew best what we, the people, needed. That's how they would probably phrase it if they were cornered. But the reality is that they want to control the system so that the people that fund them and back their candidates, the Epstein class, can continue to control the narratives and maintain control over the systems that we all suffer under. And you have a similar but different nature when it comes to the RNC and the Republican Party. It's not so blatant as it was with the Democratic Party, but there is an in club and an out club. And there are certain points where if you are not in lockstep with the Conservative Party, you're never going to get the party support, and you are never going to get a chance to make it to the big stage and let the American people hear your ideas. So it is, again, something that's happening on both sides. And it comes back to this idea of the wealthy, the powerful, and the connected getting to decide who we get to vote for. And that's why one point I would make is that I think it's very important that folks, voters, we have the primary election and then we have the general election. And the primary election has traditionally a very low voter turnout. The primary election is when the conservative voters get to decide who their candidate's going to be, or when the Democratic voters get to decide who their Democratic candidate's going to be. And that is not an election that gets as much attention as it should. And I think a lot of citizens sleep on this, which means the only people that really turn out in large numbers and vote in the primaries are the most politically engaged and people who overwhelmingly tend to be on one ideological extreme or the other. Or if not on one extreme or the other, because in the case of the Democratic side, it's not so much that they are ideologically extreme, it's that overwhelmingly the folks that turn out to Democratic primaries are the most no matter who kind of loyal, stay the course, centrist, corporate style Democrats. Because the extreme, and I have issues with that term, but the extreme on the left are folks, there are better names I could bring up than this one, but this is the name that everybody knows. And the reason I would say there are better is that this guy has been around for so long that both the corporatist Democrats as well as the Conservative Party have done an expert job of demonizing this individual to the point where most people will dismiss him out of hand. But Bernie Sanders. And I find it really interesting when they call him extreme, because the guy has never really made the whole, and I apologize for those of you who are sensitive to this stuff, but he has never made the woke DEI thing a big part of his brand or his messaging. He's never made environmentalism a huge part of his branding or messaging. He has been hammering home one thing and only one thing only, going back to the late 70s. And that is, the rich keep getting richer, and they're buying up our politicians and our elections and our whole system, that corporations have way too much influence over both our politics but also our lives, and working people need to be able to afford a good middle class life. That is, he has been all in on working class people getting health care, being able to afford their health care, being able to afford homes, being able to have the freedom to start businesses if they want, put their kids through college. These are basic kitchen table, bread and butter issues. There's nothing extreme about wanting corporations to pay the taxes on their earnings. You know, a point that this is a little off of our subject, but I've seen something recently. It said they were pointing out the fact that corporations are only taxed on their money after they've factored in all of their expenses, all of their capital investments. And people are starting to point out that it's really interesting that they only have to pay taxes after they've paid all of their expenses and bills, while we, the people, have to pay taxes on our money before we've paid our rent, before we bought our groceries, before we paid our car payment, before we paid for our insurance. And if we really wanted a fair system, then maybe we should only be taxed on the money that we have after we've paid off all of those necessities for living. But I digress. That's another topic for another day. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, you know, the corruption, the fraud in our electoral system is not happening at the ballot box. The corruption and the fraud that is happening within our electoral system is in the systems by which we go about choosing the pool of candidates that we then get to cast a vote for. And that is probably the single biggest reason why we as a country go left, go right, go left, go right, go left, go right. But at the end of the day, down here on the ground, nothing really changes materially for us. In fact, slowly but surely, things are getting worse. Housing is becoming more unaffordable. Healthcare is getting more expensive while we're getting poorer outcomes. And they're able to say, oh, no, we're not going to cover that. And then you have to spend hours and hours and hours on the phone arguing with your insurance company and going back and forth between your doctors and your care providers and your specialists. And then finally, they might go ahead and pay for that necessary health care you need. But that's also part of the plan and the design, because they know a certain percentage of people aren't going to have the energy or the time or the wherewithal to go through all of those hoops to get them to pay for something that they had already agreed to pay for when you signed up for health insurance. You know, in so many different ways, things just keep getting worse. And that is because we, the people, are not being adequately heard. And the whole idea of voter fraud is, and we can go into greater detail at another time on this, but the whole notion of that is to erode our faith in democracy, to make as many of us as possible feel that voting doesn't matter, it doesn't count, and exhaust us and make us just take our hands off the wheel. And when we take our hands off the wheel, the only hands left on that wheel is the Epstein class. And I don't think any of us, if we stop and we think about it, really want that. So the claims of voter fraud, you know, are overblown. I'm going to go back to our current leader's relationship with this issue. You know, after he lost the 2020 election and Biden won, for the next year, there was legal case after legal case after legal case after legal case that were brought, trying to prove that there was some malfeasance or there was some significant voter fraud that caused him to lose that election. And I encourage you to do your own research on this. But the reality is, every single one of these cases that went to trial, the overwhelming majority of these, let me be clear on that, overwhelming majority of those were either thrown out due to insufficient evidence or they lost the cases outright. And before anybody wants to jump in and say, well, that's because these were corrupt, Democratic-leaning judges that tried the cases, actually, Trump appointed more judges to the various circuit courts across the country than any other president before him, and a large number of those cases were actually tried and heard by judges that he himself had appointed. So if you don't think he's going to get a fair hearing from his own judges, I don't know what to tell you. The point of all this is that the issues around voter fraud are overblown, and they are yet one more in a long list of distractions to divert our attention from the real fraud, which is the elites controlling the processes by which we elect. It is a means by which they erode our faith in that process so that more of us check out, because do not forget that the largest actual percentage of the US population are either independents or non-voters. That dyed-in-the-wool Democrats and Republicans are the minority in this country. And that is something they want. Because the more of us are fed up with the system and don't want to participate anymore, the more of us who are so stressed out and so busy just trying to make ends meet that we don't have time to do the necessary research to really know who it is we're voting for, or really know the ways in which they have pulled the levers and affected the system, the more control, power, and influence they have over the policies that get enacted, the kind of politicians that get elected. And the last point that I will kind of make on this is that it is really, really, I think, important. November is only a few months away, and primaries are happening right now, kind of all over the country. The candidates are starting to come out, I would really encourage folks to, when you start seeing the ads, I'm already seeing them here in my state, and it's really interesting because there's already a candidate that I'm kind of interested in here, and this is somebody who does not accept money from corporate donors, who is not interested in accepting any money from AIPAC, which is basically a foreign government that lobbies heavily to control our policy on behalf of this. I'm not going to say the name because just look into AIPAC, and they have been caught kind of red-handed doing some very bad faith manipulations of our elections, and have done a great deal to hamstring and hobble some candidates over the last couple of years that would have done a lot of good for the working people in this country, and would have made Wall Street a little uncomfortable. So I would encourage you folks, as these names start popping up and around, actually look into who these people are, where they came from, see what they were saying and what they cared about long before the cameras were on them, and whether they fall under the red tent or the blue tent or a tent of any other color. It is really important that we start looking for and throwing our support behind, and whatever you can afford, contributions, particularly in small dollar amounts, to any candidate that seems to be talking about the things that will actually have more money in our bank accounts. And that's not just reducing taxes. That is one thing. If you're talking about reducing taxes on working people while simultaneously talking about raising taxes on the extraordinarily wealthy, I'm fine with that. But if it's just lower taxes, well, lower taxes on who? Because that's another game that gets played with us. They talk about lowering taxes, and we would all like lower taxes, right? But somebody's got to pay for fire departments, police departments, building and maintaining our roads, making sure that school teachers aren't having to buy supplies for the classes on their meager salaries. Like, we need to be paying our teachers more. I hope we can all agree on that. That there are things that we have to pay taxes for. And I am of the mind, and we on this channel are of the mind, that the working poor or working class people should not be carrying the bulk of the burden of making our society run. That those who have profited handsomely from our society, from our labor, from our communities, that those who have made it and are set and are successful and won't ever have to work another day in their life, those are the people that should be paying something back into the system from which they have gained so much. And I want to be very, very clear. I'm a big proponent there's an economist and a former Wall Street trader, although he worked out of the London financial service section. Gary Stevenson, he has a channel called Gary's Economics. And I've taken his hashtag, which is tax wealth, not work. So when I talk about raising taxes on the ultra wealthy, I'm not talking about raising, if you punch a clock, if you have to get up every day and go into work, or if you own a small business in a community, that's not who we're talking about. That's not who the vast majority of us who are talking about raising the taxes on the wealthy are talking about. We're talking about those people who, Gary Stevenson did a video just recently, and he pointed out, he says, the poorest billionaire in the world today, on average, is earning about $1 million a week in passive income. That's the poorest billionaire. Passive income. They could spend all week in bed and make $1 million. Those are the people that we're talking about taxing. Not the people who make $200K, $300K, $400K a year, getting up every day and going to work. And when you're talking about numbers, I know some of you are going to be shocked by that, but I can tell you right now, there are places like Seattle or LA or New York where making $200K a year is just enough to get by because the housing costs are so high, the transportation costs are so high, the taxes are so high. And that is largely because those dipshits who can sit on their ass for a week and earn $1 million are paying next to nothing in taxes. So that's what we're talking about. And, if we want a tax system that is beneficial to those of us who actually work for a living, that requires that we, one, have faith in our electoral system. Not that it's perfect. I'm a big proponent of ranked choice voting. And if you're interested in learning more about that or want to become involved in the efforts to implement it, I would check out Rank the Vote. They're an organization. I also believe that there's another organization called Represent Us who is doing some work in that area, and they could always use contributions. I'm sure they could also use some volunteers, but both of those organizations, they're nonpartisan. They are just trying to make some tweaks to our electoral system that make sure our voices are heard and we can start to undo the corruption that has taken it over. That corruption that, with its power and influence, wants us to lose faith in democracy. And without democracy, America ain't America. That's all I got to say on that subject today. There's a lot more that could be said, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I got stuff to do my damn self. So I want to thank you all for tuning in, for listening to what I have to say. And, remember, united we stand, divided we fall. And if you're happy with the status quo and the division, this is not a channel for you. But if you want America to be better, if you don't want to hate your neighbors and your family members and your friends anymore, and you want to have better, more informed, more nuanced conversations, stick around because we've got more to say in the future. Have a beautiful day. Thank you. Hey everybody, I want to thank you for watching the video. Please keep in mind that all of these videos are part of a much longer conversation. Recommendation would be to kind of start at the beginning so that you are all up to speed, because we'll say some crazy stuff, and if you don't have the context, you might lose that. But appreciate you guys watching. Please like, subscribe. Let's get this channel to grow so that we can build a positive community that can help heal America. Yeah. Love you all.